What if everything you were taught about God was only half the story? Not a lie, not exactly, but a story with pieces missing, pieces that were removed, pieces that were buried so deep most people never even know to ask the question.
Dame, oh Señor,
Today,
la
you're
sabiduría
going to
para
see what
guiar
was
a tu
left out.
pueblo.
And once you see
Porque de
it,
qué
you won't be
sirve
able to
toda esta
unsee it.
riqueza
This
sin tu
is the
guía?
truth they hid from you. For most of your life, you were given a version of God carved down to fit inside a sermon. Simple, safe, easy to repeat. A God who rewards good behavior and punishes bad behavior, who fits neatly into an hour on Sunday morning, who never asks anything of you that would actually cost you something. But the men and women who lived closest to God, the prophets, the disciples, the early believers who wrote and copied and guarded these texts with their lives, they didn't know a safe God. They knew a God who shook mountains, who asked impossible things, who let his own son suffer in silence before the world understood why. They knew a God who wrestled with Jacob through the night and left him limping for the rest of his life. A God who told Abraham to walk his own son up a mountain, not knowing until the very last second that it was a test and not a sacrifice. That version of God was never meant to be comfortable. But somewhere along the way, comfort became the goal. And what got left behind was the part that made faith costly, the part that made it real. Let's go back to the beginning, not of the world, but of the book itself, because the Bible you hold or scroll through on your phone did not simply fall from the sky in one piece. It was assembled, chosen, debated, fought over, in some cases literally, by men in rooms making decisions about what the rest of history would be allowed to read. Here is what almost no one tells you in Sunday school. The early church did not agree on one single tidy version of Scripture. For the first few centuries after Christ, communities of believers across the Roman world were reading, copying, and teaching from a much wider collection of texts than what eventually became the Bible you know today. Letters, Gospels, Apocalypses, histories. Some of these texts were eventually recognized as authoritative and preserved. Others were not. There were councils. There were arguments. There were texts that circulated among believers for decades, sometimes centuries, read aloud in gatherings, copied by hand, trusted enough to shape how entire communities understood their faith, that were later set aside when the official canon was formalized, not necessarily because they were false. In many cases, because they were inconvenient, because they asked harder questions than the ones that made it into the final collection. Take the Gospel of Thomas, for example, a text discovered in the Egyptian desert in 1945, part of a larger collection now known as the Nag Hammadi Library. It doesn't tell a story in the way Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do. There's no birth narrative, no crucifixion scene laid out in dramatic detail. Instead, it's a collection of sayings, over 100 short teachings attributed to Jesus, some familiar, some strange, some that read almost like riddles. Scholars still debate how old it really is, whether it predates the 4 Gospels we know or came later, whether it preserves genuine early tradition or reflects ideas that developed afterward. What's not up for debate is that early Christians in some regions were reading it, and it did not become part of the New Testament. Why not? Partly because of questions about who actually wrote it, partly because some of its ideas didn't line up cleanly with what was becoming mainstream church teaching, and partly, historians believe, because texts like this one showed a faith that was still being figured out, messier, more open-ended, less certain of its own boundaries than the version the church wanted to present to the wider world as it grew. Or consider the Book of Enoch. This one is different because, unlike Thomas, Enoch was actually known and referenced by name inside the Bible itself. The Book of Jude, a short letter near the end of the New Testament, directly quotes a prophecy attributed to Enoch, a man mentioned all the way back in Genesis, a man the text says walked so closely with God that he never experienced death at all. He was simply taken. Enoch describes visions of the heavens, accounts of rebellious angels descending to earth, warnings about judgment and the fate of the world. Some of its imagery echoes throughout later biblical prophecy, including passages in the New Testament that scholars believe were directly shaped by it. For centuries, Enoch was treated as scripture in parts of the early church. It's still part of the biblical canon today in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, one of the oldest continuous Christian communities in the world. But in most of the Western Church, it didn't make the final cut. Partly due to questions about authorship, was this really written by Enoch himself, a man who lived before the flood, or by someone writing under his name centuries later? Partly because some of its content, particularly around angels and the origins of evil in the world, raised theological questions that made church leaders uneasy. So here is the pattern worth sitting with. These weren't obscure fringe writings invented by heretics in some back room. These were texts that real communities of early believers read, trusted, and in some cases treated as sacred. Texts that shaped how millions of people across centuries understood who God was and what he was doing in the world. And piece by piece, counsel by counsel, decision by decision, the collection was narrowed, refined, made smaller, safer, and more uniform. That process wasn't necessarily corrupt. Many of the people making these decisions believed sincerely that they were protecting the faith from confusion and error, preserving what was most reliably traced back to the earliest witnesses of Christ. That's a real and defensible motivation. But it's also true that the version of the story you inherited is the result of human decisions, made in specific rooms, by specific people, shaped by the politics and pressures of their specific moment in history. It was not handed down untouched from heaven in the form you now hold. And once you understand that the boundaries of Scripture were drawn by people, you start to notice something else. Even within the texts that did make it into the final Bible, the picture of God that emerges is far less tidy than the version most people were taught. Look closely at the prophets, men like Jeremiah, who at one point in his own writings accuses God directly of deceiving him, of tricking him into a calling he never wanted and couldn't escape. Look at Job, an entire book built around a man demanding answers from God for suffering he didn't deserve. And God's response isn't a neat explanation. It's a whirlwind of questions that essentially says, you don't have the capacity to understand this, and I'm not going to pretend you do. Look at the Psalms, half of which are not praise at all, but raw, unfiltered complaint, writers screaming at God to wake up, to show up, to explain himself, sometimes accusing him outright of abandoning them. This is not the God most people were introduced to growing up. Most people were introduced to a God who answers prayers cleanly, who rewards faith with comfort, who exists mainly to make you feel better on your worst days. But the actual texts, even the ones that survived every council, every debate, every act of editing across 2,000 years, describe something far more complicated. A God who is present in the mess, not absent from it. A God who can handle being questioned, argued with, even accused, and doesn't strike people down for it. Consider the disciples themselves, the men history remembers as pillars of the early church. Peter denied knowing Jesus 3 times in a single night, out loud, to strangers, while the man he claimed to follow was being tortured a few feet away. Thomas refused to believe the resurrection had happened at all until he could physically put his hands in the wounds. Paul, before he was Paul, back when he was still called Saul, actively hunted down and imprisoned early Christians, and by his own account, approved of at least 1 execution. These are not clean origin stories. These are stories of people failing publicly more than once, in ways that would end most careers today, long before they became the men history remembers as saints and pillars of the faith. But somewhere in how this story gets retold from the pulpit, the mess gets smoothed over. Peter becomes simply the rock the church was built on, without much time spent on the night he swore he'd never met Jesus. Paul becomes simply the great missionary, without much time spent on the years he spent trying to destroy the very movement he'd eventually die for. The story gets edited, not maliciously but instinctively, into something cleaner, safer, easier to hold up as an example without complicating the lesson, and that instinct to smooth things over didn't stop with the original councils that assembled the Bible. It's been happening ever since. Generation after generation, sermon after sermon. Each time the story gets retold, a little more of the mess gets trimmed away, until what's left is a version of God and faith that's almost unrecognizable next to what the actual ancient texts describe. Here's the part that will change how you see everything. The moment you strip away the sanitized version, the version built for comfort, for easy answers, for a God who never makes you uncomfortable, something shifts. God stops being a distant idea you're supposed to admire from a safe distance and becomes something you can actually wrestle with. Because if he was patient with prophets who accused him of trickery, patient with a sufferer who demanded answers he never fully received, patient with disciples who failed him publicly and repeatedly before they ever got it right, then maybe he is patient with you too. Maybe the doubt you've been hiding, the anger you've never said out loud, the questions you were taught were dangerous to even ask. Maybe none of that disqualifies you from this story. Maybe it puts you closer to the center of it than you ever realized. You were never meant to have it all figured out. You were meant to keep showing up, questions and all. The same way Jacob kept wrestling through the night. The same way Job kept demanding an answer. The same way Peter kept following, even after he'd failed in the worst possible way. That's the truth that was hidden. Not because it was dangerous to the world, but because it was too honest for comfort, too honest for a faith that had started to prioritize being easy to teach over being true to what actually happened. And once you see that, you start to read everything differently. The prophets stop being distant historical figures and start looking like people who actually struggled the way you struggle. The disciples stop being untouchable heroes and start looking like people who actually failed the way you fail. And God, the version buried underneath centuries of careful editing and comfortable retelling, starts looking a lot less like a distant judge and a lot more like someone who has been in the mess with humanity the entire time, waiting for people to stop pretending they have it together and start being honest. That was the truth they left out. Not because it would destroy your faith, but because it might actually save it, by making it real for the first time. If this opened your eyes to something you never knew before, that's exactly why this channel exists. To bring back the parts of the story that were left out, one video at a time. Subscribe, and let's keep uncovering the truth together.